The first shot misses his ear by the width of a cigarette paper. Tech Sergeant Cleto Rodriguez doesn't flinch. He is pressed flat against the scorched limestone wall of Paco Railroad Station in Manila, Philippines. The date is February 9th, 1945. The smoke smells of burned stone and something worse underneath it. The ground beneath his palms is warm from a fire that has been burning since before dawn. His left forearm is bleeding through the sleeve, a graze wound, not deep enough to stop him, deep enough that he can feel it with every heartbeat. His mouth tastes like dust and copper. There are approximately 80 Japanese soldiers between him and the objective, and there is no one left beside him. There was someone. 20 minutes ago, there was someone. Now there is only Rodriguez. And before we get to what he did next, you need to understand what he was looking at. The Paco Railroad Station had been transformed into a fortress by the Manila Naval Defense Force over the course of 6 days. Not improvised, engineered. The garrison had knocked rifle holes through the station's colonial-era limestone walls at chest height, positioned Type 92 heavy machine guns to command every open approach, and constructed overlapping fields of fire so precisely that any attacker approaching from any direction would immediately be taken under fire from at least 2 separate weapons simultaneously. They had pre-ranged every piece of cover within 60 meters of the wall. They had sandbagged the entrance gates with the quiet confidence of men who have watched their position hold against everything thrown at it. Before Rodriguez reached this wall that morning, the Japanese garrison at Paco had never lost a single man to the American assaults probing the southern Manila front. Not one. 2 previous American patrol-level attacks had been turned back within 40 seconds. The position had eaten men alive, and the soldiers defending it knew exactly what they were defending. One American soldier, alone, against a fortified position that had beaten every coordinated attack sent against it. Here is what you need to understand about the weapon the United States Army built in men like Cleto Rodriguez. Japan never found a way to counter it. Not once. Not in the entire Pacific War. Because it wasn't something you could put in an intelligence report or pre-range in a field of fire. By the time you understood what it was already inside your perimeter. San Marcos, Texas. Population 7,000. A river town that smelled of cedar and muddy water, and the particular kind of American working-class dignity that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Cleto Lucio Rodriguez was born on April 26, 1923, the son of Mexican-American parents who had built a life with their hands in a country that didn't always make that easy. His father worked long days doing the kind of labor that doesn't come with a title. His mother ran the household with the quiet ferocity of a woman who understood that family was not a thing you had. It was a thing you built every single day with everything you were. She was the kind of woman who wrote carefully because she hadn't had much school, but who thought hard about every word before she put it on paper. Rodriguez was 19 years old when he enlisted in 1942. He was not a boy chasing glory. He was not someone with a grudge or a point to prove. He enlisted because the country was at war, and because in San Marcos, Texas, that year, if you were young and able-bodied, you simply went. That was the arithmetic of the era, and Rodriguez had always been good at arithmetic. His platoon sergeant in the 148th Infantry Regiment, 37th Infantry Division, would describe him years later as the kind of soldier you don't worry about. In the language of enlisted men, that was the highest possible compliment. It didn't mean Rodriguez was ordinary. It meant he was solid in a way that made every man around him steadier just by proximity. It meant that when things went wrong, and in the Pacific, things always went wrong, you could look to your left. We'll find Rodriguez still there, still calculating, still looking for the angle that got you both out alive, and somehow that was enough to keep you moving. He was not large, not physically imposing in the way war movies demand of their heroes. Medium height, compact build. A face that took some time to open up, but once it did, you understood immediately why the men in his unit liked being near him. In his breast pocket, folded into a square no larger than a pack of matches, he carried a letter from his mother, written in the careful Spanish she used for important things. He had not opened it since Lady, 3 months earlier. He had told his foxhole mate, Private First Class John Reese, from Muskogee, Oklahoma, who laughed easily and carried a photograph of his younger sister in his helmet liner, that he was saving the letter, that he would read it again when Manila was done. Reese had grinned and called him superstitious. Rodriguez had said, "Not superstitious, careful." He would think about that exchange later. He would think about it for the rest of his life. The distance from San Marcos, Texas, to the ruins of Manila, Philippines, is not a journey anyone makes without losing something along the way. But what Rodriguez brought into that Pacific War, the steadiness, the patience, the absolute refusal to panic when everything fell apart, those things did not get left behind on any transport ship or jungle trail. They traveled with him into the city, into the station, into the silence after the last shot. This video gives you the story. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details. You've forgotten heroes. Free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description. Now back in the video. By February of 1945, Manila was dying in ways no one had predicted and no one would soon forget. General Douglas MacArthur had declared the Philippine Islands liberated. He was not wrong. The islands were being liberated, kilometer by contested kilometer, at a cost no planning document had accurately forecast. Because General Yamashita had intended to withdraw from Manila entirely, to fight his campaign of attrition from the mountains and let the capital fall without a battle. What Yamashita had not accounted for was Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi. Iwabuchi commanded the Manila Naval Defense Force, approximately 17,000 Japanese sailors and soldiers who had been ordered to evacuate, but who, under Iwabuchi's command, had chose instead to fortify every colonial building, every railway station, every walled compound in the city. Iwabuchi had effectively turned the Pearl of the Orient into a killing field, and the civilian population trapped inside it, over 100,000 Filipino men, women, and children, was caught between two armies in the most brutal urban battle the Pacific War would produce. Paco Railroad Station was one of Iwabuchi's most formidable strongpoints, and the men defending it had earned that reputation. The garrison was drawn from elements of the 31st Infantry Regiment and Iwabuchi's Naval Infantry. soldiers who had been in continuous combat since the American landings, and who had spent 6 days preparing the station's defenses with the specific knowledge of men who intended to die there. Their commander, a lieutenant whose name appears in captured documents only as Tay, was identified in post-battle intelligence assessments as a veteran of fighting in China, a man who had trained his defenders with the practical lessons of years of urban warfare. He had drilled his men on the interlocking fields of fire. He had pre-positioned his ammunition reserves inside the station's stone interior, protected from artillery. He had identified every piece of cover within 60 meters of his wall and assigned a gun crew to each one. Previous American attempts to probe this position had been instructive. A 6-man patrol from B Company had tried to cross the open ground to the south entrance 3 days before Rodriguez's assault. They had been cut down in less than 40 seconds. Not a single man had reached within 20 meters of the wall, and the garrison had not lost one defender in those exchanges. Lieutenant Tay had reportedly told his remaining senior petty officers that the position could hold indefinitely, that the Americans had not yet sent enough force to threaten it, and that when they finally did, the walls and the firepower would answer them. He was not wrong about any of this. He was only wrong about one thing. The intelligence given to Rodriguez's unit before the assault stated approximately 60 to 70 defenders, concentrated primarily in the station's main hall, with 2 or possibly 3 heavy machine gun positions covering the main approaches. A manageable objective for a coordinated company-level assault. The plan called for suppressing fire from the western flank, while Rodriguez's element advanced in a 2-section bounding overwatch from the east. And the plan hit reality at 0730 hours on February 9th, and the collision was catastrophic. There were not 60 to 70 defenders. The position had been reinforced overnight. Elements of a naval infantry company had moved into the compound during the hours of darkness, more than doubling the garrison's effective strength. The machine gun positions identified by intelligence were still there, exactly where they had been marked on the map. But there were at minimum 4 additional positions that had not existed 24 hours earlier, including a concealed Type 96 light machine gun nest built directly into the rubble pile on the eastern approach, precisely where Rodriguez's element was supposed to advance. The first burst of fire from that hidden position killed 2 men in the opening 3 seconds of the assault, and then the radio crackled with orders that made every bad thing worse. Battalion Command, reacting to mounting pressure elsewhere along the Manila front, at points that were bleeding men at a faster rate, issued a redirect. The assault on Paco was to be suspended. The unit was to pull back and reorient to support the push developing near Intramuros. The timing was a disaster. Half the assault element had already committed to the approach. The squad leader who received the order tried to pull his men back in good order, but in the smoke and chaos of withdrawal under coordinated Japanese fire, the formation broke apart, the way formations under fire always break apart. Not in one piece, but in fragments, each fragment trying to survive its own immediate 10 seconds. Men fell back in sections, and the smoke from the initial Japanese response swallowed the approach lanes. And Rodriguez, who had advanced with PFC John Reese on the right flank, pushing farther than the other elements before the order came through, found himself 70 meters from the station wall, with his unit in withdrawal behind him, with a radio that produced only static, and with a withdrawal route now crossing directly under the Type 96 that had just destroyed the assault's opening seconds. He could not go back, not without dying in the attempt. Reese looked at him through the smoke. Rodriguez looked at Reese. No orders he could follow, no backup coming. 4 8-round clips for his M1 Garand, 1 fragmentation grenade, a half canteen of water he could feel sloshing with every heartbeat. The graze wound on his left forearm, already soaking through the sleeve. 1 station, still in Japanese hands. 1 mission that command had called off, and circumstances had not. Rodriguez was too deep in. The mission was still active. He and Reese advanced together at first, using the collapsed outer wall for cover, working in coordinated bounds toward the compound's eastern approach, while the garrison's guns rotated to track any movement they detected. The Japanese response was not panicked. Understand that. These were not frightened men firing blindly into smoke. The garrison at Paco Station was commanded by a man who had drilled his defenders for exactly this scenario. While his gun crews maintained their assigned sectors of fire with textbook precision, Lieutenant Tay moved through the station's interior, speaking to each position in turn, directing adjustments with the deliberate calm of a commander who knows his position is impregnable and is simply waiting for the attacker to exhaust himself against it. And his confidence was not misplaced. Every approach to the station wall was assigned to a specific weapon. Every piece of cover had been pre-ranged. The Type 92 on the western archway covered the south wall at grazing fire. The Type 96 in the rubble commanded the entire eastern quadrant. Between them, there was not an angle of attack that was not simultaneously under fire from at least 2 weapons. Tay had built what military engineers call an interlocking defensive system, a network where destroying any one position simply exposed the attacker to fire from 2 others. His men were moving with professional efficiency, and their voices were steady. Not one of them showed the slightest concern. They had done everything right. Their position was perfect. The viewer must understand this. Rodriguez and Reese had covered 45 meters when the rubble exploded. Not literally, but the sound was comparable. The concealed flanking position, a 2-man rifle team dug into the eastern ruins, invisible from any approach, silent until this exact moment, opened fire from less than 15 meters. A kill zone, a perfectly sprung ambush at the moment of maximum exposure. The rounds hit the ground directly in front of Rodriguez and kicked debris into his face. He dove right. Reese dove left. The rifle team was positioned between them. 2 trained riflemen, 15 meters, absolute advantage. Rodriguez had 3 seconds before the next burst corrected onto him. Maybe 2. He did not think. 3 years of training do not produce thought in moments like this. They produce reaction. He rolled left along the debris, came up behind a fractured block of masonry, barely large enough to conceal a crouching man, and in the same continuous motion, his right hand found the fragmentation grenade on his belt. The rifleman tracked the roll. They fired at where he had been. The first round struck the masonry half an inch from his hand and sent a chip into his cheek. He pulled the pin with his teeth because his left hand was wet with blood. He held the spoon for 2 full seconds, long enough for the men in the pit to know it was coming, and not long enough for them to do anything about it. He stood, fully exposed, for just long enough. He threw flat and hard. The grenade went into the rifle pit at a flat angle and detonated before either man inside could move. 4 seconds, start to finish. What he did in the next 90 seconds made no tactical sense on the surface, until you understand what he had already seen, something no one else still standing on that battlefield could see. Reese was hit in that opening exchange. Not fatally, a round through the upper left arm that spun him behind the low remnant of a courtyard wall. Rodriguez reached him in the smoke, assessed the wound, looked at Reese's face, and saw what needed to be seen. "Can you fire?" Rodriguez asked. Reese tried to raise the rifle. The arm wouldn't cooperate. The bleeding was heavy and getting heavier. Rodriguez left him with 2 magazines and specific instructions. Fire from this position at irregular intervals and keep their attention on the eastern wall. Then Rodriguez turned, alone, and walked back toward the station. The first sign that something had changed inside the garrison came approximately 6 minutes later. The Japanese garrison's tactical picture had been clean when the assault began. Multiple Americans advancing on the eastern approach, a manageable assault, the kind their training had prepared them for. But now, their radio reports began contradicting each other. The rifle team in the rubble was not responding. The Type 96 crew reported movement on the eastern wall, but the movement was sporadic, directionally inconsistent, not matching any coherent assault pattern. Lieutenant Tay tried to recount his attackers through the smoke. His petty officers relayed conflicting numbers from the gun positions. How many? 2 on the east, and maybe 3, possibly 1 on the north, another on the eastern wall again. A captured diary, recovered from the Paco position during the subsequent clearing operation, and later translated by Nisei interpreters attached to the 37th Division, contains an entry written by a petty officer 2nd class during this phase of the battle. The entry reads, "The squad leaders are reporting contradictions. Men who are certain they counted 2 attackers are receiving fire from angles that require those same men to be in 2 places at once. The lieutenant is trying to establish the count. We cannot establish the count." The answer Lieutenant Tay gave his men: at least a full squad, possibly more. Hold all positions. There was no squad. There was 1 man with 24 rounds, a bleeding forearm, wasn't a plan built on something he had noticed during the original approach that everyone else had missed. Rodriguez moved counterclockwise around the compound's perimeter, using the destroyed outbuildings as cover, working against the direction the garrison had oriented its fire. He covered 60 meters of exposed terrain in a series of 4-second bounds. Move, drop, wait, move again, while Reese's sporadic fire from the eastern wall held at least 2 gun crews looking the wrong direction. He took a position on the compound's north side, locating a bomb-blasted gap in the limestone wall he had marked during the original advance. A gap 6 feet wide, his entry point. He was 15 meters from it when he stopped. Not enemy fire. Sound. Children. Crying. Inside the compound wall. He held completely still and listened. And the sound confirmed itself. 2 or 3 voices, small, coming from a ruined outbuilding immediately inside the gap. He moved to the wall's edge and looked through a rifle hole in the limestone. 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, none older than 10, pressed into the far corner of the outbuilding, white with plaster dust. The girl was clutching a broken rosary so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. They were alive, and they were directly in the path of every approach route Rodriguez had calculated to reach the station's northern machine gun position. He stared at them for 2 full seconds. The clock of the assault was running. He stared at them anyway. Then he mentally closed the assault plan he had been working through. Every angle and bound and timing sequence he had calculated, and he started over. New route, one that kept the children behind him at every stage. One that required him to cross 30 meters of open ground with no usable cover in order to approach the northern gun from an angle that placed them outside the line of fire. 30 meters of open ground. Across the front of the fortress that had destroyed every coordinated attack, with 1 clip left and a wound that was soaking through faster. He started moving. The irrational decision from the ambush, the thing that had made no tactical sense, resolved itself in the next 4 minutes. When he had stood up and let the rifle team in the pit see him throw the grenade, it had looked like desperation. It was actually calculation. Because by letting those 2 men see his exact position and exact action at that specific moment, he had forced the entire garrison to track his location there, which meant when he disappeared and reappeared from an entirely different direction 60 seconds later, every gun crew in that fortress was looking at where he had been, not where he was. He had used himself as his own decoy. He had been setting it up from the moment the ambush sprang, because the moment the ambush sprang was the moment he understood the garrison's command and control well enough to exploit it. He crossed the 30 meters at a low run. The northern gun crew tracked him and hesitated. He reached the dead ground behind the position. He put the position down with his last grenade and his rifle's final rounds from that clip. He took ammunition from the fallen crew. He kept moving. Inside the compound now. The children were behind him, in the outbuilding. Ahead, the station's main hall. 2 Type 92 positions still operational. 30-plus defenders reorganizing under a commander who still believed he was facing a full American squad and could not understand why his perimeter was collapsing. He found a section of standing interior wall, and he stopped. His body had been keeping a ledger that his mind had not had time to read, and it presented itself now all at once. The left forearm wound had bled through the sleeve twice and dried into a dark crust, still seeping underneath but holding. The right knee had caught something in the crawl through the rubble, not a bullet, a chunk of masonry edge, and the joint had swollen enough that bending below 90 degrees produced a white-hot current through the whole leg. The canteen was empty. He had 9 rounds in the M1, 6 from the clip he'd taken off the northern gun crew, and no other ammunition that was his. He had been in this compound for just over 2 hours. The main hall was 40 meters ahead. 2 heavy machine guns still operational. Between 30 and 50 men, reorganizing. He pressed his back against the interior wall, and the full weight of his situation settled onto him. Every man who has ever been in a place remotely resembling this one knows what this moment is. The body stops its emergency overrides, and the mind, suddenly no longer focused purely on the 10-foot radius of survival, opens up and shows you the whole picture. What Rodriguez could see, with the terrible clarity that comes from exhaustion and blood loss and the particular silence between fire, was that the arithmetic of what remained did not work. He had beaten odds that should not have been beaten twice. The garrison knew something was wrong, but didn't know what. His element of confusion, the only thing keeping him alive, against numbers that should have overwhelmed him long ago, would not survive contact with the main hall. They would be waiting, prepared. The orders had said to withdraw. There was still a way out. Back through the northern gap, retrieve Reese, exit through the eastern rubble. That was not cowardice. Every authority in his chain of command had explicitly ordered exactly that course of action. Following an order to withdraw is not failure. It is discipline. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the floor to make them still. The floor was warm. He pressed harder. He thought about Reese against the eastern wall, calling him superstitious. He thought about the 3 children in the corner of the outbuilding, white with plaster dust. The girl's broken rosary, the specific way she had looked at him when he pointed toward the gap in the wall and told her, "When the shooting starts inside, run." And then, before he had consciously decided anything, his hand went to his breast pocket. The letter was there, folded into its small square, the paper damp with sweat and slightly soft at the creases. He did not take it out. He pressed his palm flat against the place where it rested and felt the shape of it through the fabric and the dog tags and the blood-stained sleeve. He knew what it said. He had memorized it before Leyte. His mother had written in the careful Spanish of a woman who thinks hard before she writes. She had written, "Come home. Whatever else happens, come home." He held his hand there for 3 breaths. Then he took it away. "All right," he said. "To no one. To Reese, to San Marcos, Texas. To whatever remained that he had promised he was coming home to." He stood up. He moved. No cover this time. No bounds. No elaborate geometry. He came directly at the nearest position, fast, crouched low, firing the M1 as he closed, because a Type 92 heavy machine gun cannot depress its barrel fast enough to track a man approaching inside 15 meters at an angle below the gun's line of fire. The crew tried to swing the weapon manually, and they were still adjusting when Rodriguez put 2 rounds through the position from 8 meters and kept moving without breaking stride, into the main hall. And here is where the story becomes something other than a tactical account. Here is where the enemy's own words become the only adequate testimony. What had been, at 07:30 that morning, a calm and professionally directed defense had become, by 09:50, something that no training document Lieutenant Tay had ever studied contained a chapter on. Because the manuals were written for attackers, plural, for assault elements with support elements and command elements and radio communication between them, for suppressing fire and reinforcing waves and clear axes of advance. The manuals assumed numbers, because numbers are what armies field, and the manuals had no chapter for one man who kept coming regardless of what the garrison did to him. Men were abandoning prepared positions, not being driven out, not flanked, but leaving because positions they had held with absolute confidence were falling around them, in a pattern they could not track or predict. Senior Petty Officer Miyamoto, was trying to coordinate a response to what his gun crews were reporting, but the reports from different positions described different threats from different directions. And when he tried to consolidate them into a coherent tactical picture, they didn't fit together. He moved through the station, calling to positions that did not answer. Not because the men in them were dead, some were, and some weren't, but because men who had been trained to hold their positions as a unit were no longer functioning as a unit. They were functioning as frightened individuals trying to survive the next 10 seconds. And frightened individuals in a fortified position are more dangerous to each other than to the enemy because they fire at movement and sound rather than at identified targets. The sounds of the garrison's collapse were specific. From the deposition of Corporal Hayashi, taken in late February 1945 and translated by a Nisei interpreter, attached to the 37th Division's intelligence section, I could hear the men in the East Hall calling to each other. Not orders, just calling. Mada imasuka. Still there? Are you still there? I told my crew to hold fire until we had a target. We could hear shooting, but we could not establish the location. My gunner said he had a target. I asked where. He pointed toward the smoke. I told him to wait. Then the shooting was behind us. He moved, fired, dropped, moved again. 30 meters of interior space. The last 3 positions fell in sequence, each one taken from a direction that the previous position's collapse had opened. The final Type 92, Corporal Hayashi's gun, was silenced when Rodriguez came through the smoke from the northwest at a range of 8 meters. His M1 locked open on an empty chamber after the last round, and Hayashi's gunner, faced with something crossing the kill zone that should not have been possible, did not fire. He held his fire for 1 second. 1 second was enough. The main hall of Paco Railroad Station fell silent. Rodriguez stood in the smoke with an empty rifle and hands that had begun shaking again, and he looked at what remained. The objective was taken. The children in the outbuilding were behind him. He had kept them behind him at every stage. Reese was alive against the eastern wall. He sat down on the floor. He pressed his palm flat against his breast pocket, against the letter. He held it there until his hands went still. Elements of Company B and the battalion's medical team reached the Paco compound entrance at approximately 10:40 hours. They stopped at the gate and stood without moving. The position that had repelled 2 American probing attacks and been assessed as an all-day operation, requiring full company strength to reduce, had been taken by 1 man. The physical evidence throughout the compound was unambiguous. Approximately 82 Japanese defenders accounted for across the 3 main defensive areas. 41 distinct firing positions destroyed, cleared, or abandoned. Both Type 92 heavy machine guns rendered inoperable. Ammunition stockpiles untouched. The garrison had been overwhelmed too quickly to exhaust its supply. The battalion's medical officer found Rodriguez seated against the south interior wall, applying field dressing to his forearm with methodical calm. A Japanese cigarette, found somewhere in the debris, sat unlit at his feet. He had apparently picked it up and then lost track of why. The battalion's operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Sherrill, would say in a recorded interview decades later, "I walked into that station looking for a company, yet what I found was a sergeant. Now, here is what the Japanese said. Corporal Hayashi was taken prisoner during the final clearing operation and processed through the 37th Division's prisoner collection point in Pasay District. His interrogation, conducted through an interpreter and later declassified as part of the Army's Manila campaign documentation, contains the following exchange. The interrogator asked how many Americans had attacked the position. Hayashi answered that he believed it was approximately 30 men, possibly more. They had used the smoke and rubble to conceal their numbers. The interrogator showed him the after-action report. 1. Hayashi told the interpreter there had been an error in translation. The interrogator showed him the report again. The record notes that Hayashi was silent for an extended period before responding. He then said, through the interpreter, "That is not a thing a human soldier does. That is something else." When the interpreter pressed for clarification, Hayashi said that in the garrison's final minutes, as positions fell in a sequence that no defender could track because it followed no conventional assault pattern, the surviving men had stopped calling tactical information to each other. They had simply been calling names, calling positions. "Madaimasu ka?" Still there? Still there? And the silences that answered them were the worst sound he had ever heard in his years of military service, because the silence was not enemy fire. It was just absence. The prisoners from the Paco garrison held together at the Pasay collection point. It gave Rodriguez a name among themselves in the days that followed. The name was reported to 37th Division Intelligence by the Nisei interpreters who worked the compound. The name was Kage no Hitori, the shadow who comes alone. The name was born from a specific moment that multiple surviving prisoners described independently, without coordination. It was the moment Rodriguez had walked across 30 meters of open ground toward the northern machine gun position, in full view, without cover, without hurrying. The Type 96 crew had tracked him in their sights. The gunner had him, and something about what was crossing that open ground, the pace of it, the absolute absence of the desperate, crouching movement of a man who believes he can be killed, caused the gunner to hesitate. He hesitated for 1 second. Rodriguez reached the dead ground behind the position. That hesitation, that 1 second, that inability to fire at something that moved like it was beyond the reach of their weapons, that was what gave him the name. Not admiration for their enemy's cause. Not weakness. Professional soldiers giving a professional name to something that had shattered their professional calculations so completely they could find no other category for it. Petty Officer Second Class Tanaka, one of the few surviving officers from the garrison, gave the most formal enemy testimony on record. Asked specifically in a subsequent interrogation session about the American who had reduced the Paco position, Tanaka reportedly said, translated from his written statement, that in his years of service he had faced many enemies. He had been trained to face many kinds of soldiers. He had never been trained to face this one. He wrote, "He did not attack the position. He attacked each of us, individually, separately, as if the position itself was irrelevant, and we were what he had come for. None of our training prepared us for an enemy who fought that way." Then there was Marta. The Filipino relief workers who entered the compound with the American forces found 3 children in the outbuilding near the northern wall. Marta was 9 years old. she was still holding the broken rosary. She told the relief worker, in Tagalog, that the American soldier had come to them before the last attack, that he had spoken to them in broken words, a mix of English and gestures and the few phrases he had picked up, and that he had pressed their hands together and pointed at the gap in the wall. When the shooting starts inside, he had told them, "You go through the gap and run toward the street. Don't stop. Run toward the street." Marta was asked what she remembered about the soldier. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "He was shaking, but he came back for us anyway." Tech Sergeant Clito L. Rodriguez received the Medal of Honor. It was presented by President Harry S. Truman at the White House. Rodriguez was 21 years old. The official citation reads, "In part, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, with Private First Class John N. Reese, Jr., voluntarily and with consummate daring, were advanced alone to within 20 yards of the nearest enemy emplacement. From this exposed position, he hurled grenades into the opening, killing the two-man crew and destroying the position. Moving to the next emplacement, he threw more grenades and killed its garrison. Entering the building, he found 2 more enemy machine guns. He killed the crews and silenced the guns. In rapid succession, he attacked 6 more emplacements, each time entering or approaching within close range of the enemy position and putting it out of action. He and Private Reese, continuing their assault, destroyed approximately 82 Japanese and 41 enemy positions, thus eliminating an entire perimeter of enemy defenses. The dauntless courage and magnificent heroism displayed by Technical Sergeant Rodriguez inspired all the men of his regiment and reflect the highest traditions of the military service. Clito Rodriguez came home to San Marcos, Texas. He was not a man who talked about Manila easily, or much at all. His sister recalled, in an interview from the 1980s, that he carried the events of that February morning the way that generation carried most things, completely, quietly, without asking anyone else to carry any part of it. He worked. He raised a family. He was present in his community in the specific way of men who have seen enough of absence to understand what presence is worth. He did not know about the name Kage no Hitori until decades later, when a military historian translating a collection of prisoner interrogation transcripts identified the Paco position and recognized the details of Hayashi's testimony. When told what the Japanese garrison had called him, Rodriguez was reportedly silent for several seconds. Then he said, "They didn't need to give me a name. I just needed to come home." He kept the letter. Don't let anyone tell you the weapon was the rifle. The M1 Garand was a magnificent instrument, the finest semi-automatic infantry rifle in the world in 1945, and every soldier who carried one understood that. But the weapon, Japan never found a way to counter, wasn't manufactured in Springfield, Massachusetts. It couldn't be blueprinted or reverse engineered. It couldn't be neutralized with a counter tactic or pre-ranged in a field of fire. The weapon was the man who kept moving after the plan collapsed. Because here is what actually happened at Paco Railroad Station on the morning of February 9th, 1945. The intelligence was wrong. Enemy numbers were more than double what command had reported. The route was compromised before the first shot was fired. The orders changed at the worst possible moment. At the moment, his unit needed clarity and received contradiction. His unit withdrew and he was too deep inside to follow without dying in the attempt. An ambush sprung from a position that should have been clear. He found children in the middle of a kill zone and rewrote every calculation he had made to keep them alive, at the cost of 30 meters of open ground with no cover and a garrison still fully operational. He fought the rest of it on 9 rounds, a wounded arm, borrowed ammunition from the positions he cleared, and the absolute refusal to stop, while people who needed him were still counting on him to finish. And when it was done, the men who had tried hardest to kill him, professional soldiers, battle-tested, holding an impregnable position with every advantage a defender can possess, gave him a name. Not because they were weak and he broke them easily, because they were formidable, and he broke them anyway, and they had no other word for what he was. Kage no Hitori, the shadow who comes alone. What your enemies call you, when they have no reason left to call you anything but what they saw, is the truest record of what you were on that battlefield. If you are a veteran, you know this weight. You've carried your own version of this morning, the plan that shattered, the orders that made everything worse. The moment you looked around and the only person left was you. This story isn't here to explain that to you. It's here to say, we see what that cost. Yeah, we know it doesn't come out when the uniform does. If you are not a veteran, the man who walked across 30 meters of open ground toward a Japanese machine gun in the ruins of Manila, the man who made a trained, fortified garrison of 80 soldiers believe they were facing a company when they were facing a sergeant from San Marcos, Texas, went home. He stood in his mother's kitchen. He was 21 years old with a Medal of Honor and a letter in his breast pocket that he had kept since before Leyte. He took it out. He read it again in her kitchen while she made coffee. The paper soft from 2 years of being pressed against his chest through every jungle trail and transport crossing and burning city in the Pacific War. Come home. Whatever else happens, come home. He kept the promise. Whatever else happened. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss these forgotten stories of extraordinary American courage. Who should we tell next? Drop their name in the comments. This video gives you the story. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details. Forgotten heroes. Free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the descriptions.